At 11:44 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on Saturday night, Donald Trump posted something on Truth Social that sent every energy market, every military command center, and every government in the Middle East into simultaneous high alert. He wrote in capital letters, the way he writes things he intends to be taken seriously, that if Iran does not fully open, without threat, the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from that exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. 48 hours. Power plants. Starting with the biggest one first. The deadline expires at 7:44 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday. As of this moment, that clock is still running. Iran's response came within hours. The Iranian army issued a formal statement through state media that was precise, deliberate, and unmistakable in its intent. It said that any strike on Iran's energy facilities would immediately prompt retaliatory attacks on American and Israeli energy and infrastructure assets across the region, specifically naming information technology systems and desalination facilities throughout the Gulf. Touch our power plants and every Gulf pipeline burns. Two statements, one deadline, and somewhere between them, the most dangerous 48 hours of this entire war. What we need to understand today, carefully, methodically, without flinching from what the words actually mean, is exactly what Trump is threatening, what Iran is threatening in response, what happens to 87 million Iranians and to the entire architecture of global energy supply if either side follows through, and why this specific escalation, more than any missile exchange, more than any naval confrontation, more than anything that has happened across 22 days of active war, may be the moment this conflict crosses a threshold it cannot return from. We start with what Trump is actually threatening, because the phrase power plants covers an enormous range of possible targets, and the differences between them are not academic. They are matters of life and death for tens of millions of people. The language of geopolitical crisis has a tendency to flatten the specifics, to reduce devastating technical realities into rhetorical shorthand that strips out the human weight of what is actually being discussed. That cannot happen here. The specifics are the story. Iran operates approximately 110 natural gas power plants, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. It also maintains solar, hydroelectric, wind, oil, diesel, coal, geothermal, and nuclear generation facilities. The country's electricity grid is sophisticated and deeply interconnected, a legacy of decades of sustained investment that survived even the most punishing years of international sanctions and economic isolation. This is not a fragile patchwork system. It is the central nervous system of a modern industrial society, and it serves a population of 87 million people. The largest single power generation facility in Iran is almost certainly the Damavand combined cycle power plant, located approximately 70 kilometers southeast of downtown Tehran. Its output is 2,868 megawatts, enough electricity for millions of homes and a substantial portion of Tehran's entire industrial base. The second largest is the Shahid Salimi plant in Mazandaran province, near the Caspian Sea, producing 2,215 megawatts. Third is the Shahid Rajai plant, approximately 110 kilometers northeast of Tehran, at 2,043 megawatts. For context, Florida's West County Energy Center, the largest operating natural gas power plant in the United States, produces 3,750 megawatts. Iran's biggest facility runs at roughly three-quarters of that capacity, serving a country of 87 million people with an economy that, despite years of sanctions, remains deeply dependent on a functioning electrical grid. Trump did not specify which plant he meant when he said the biggest one first. He may have been referring to Damavand. He may have been referring to Bushehr, the nuclear power plant on the Persian Gulf coast that was already struck last week, which at around 1,000 megawatts is not technically the largest facility, but carries enormous symbolic weight and radiological significance that no other target in Iran possesses. His threat was deliberately vague on specifics and precisely clear on intent. Hit and obliterate, starting with the biggest one first. The word obliterate was not chosen carelessly. Obliterate does not mean damage or degrade or reduce operating capacity. It means to remove something from existence entirely. Trump is not threatening to inconvenience Iran's electricity supply. He is threatening to eliminate the physical infrastructure that keeps the civilian population of a country of 87 million people alive. Here is the dimension of this threat that has received almost no serious attention in the media coverage of the past 12 hours, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Iran's electricity grid is not a luxury system or a military asset. It is the infrastructure that keeps a modern society functioning at the most basic level of human survival. Hospitals run on it, water treatment plants run on it, sewage systems run on it, food refrigeration and the supply chains that move perishable goods across a country of 87 million people depend on it. Communications networks, including the military communications that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps uses to coordinate its operations, run on it. When you destroy a country's largest power plants, you are not just turning off the lights, you are setting off a cascade of failures that moves through every layer of civilian life simultaneously. Without electricity, water treatment stops. Without functioning water treatment, drinking water in major urban centers becomes unsafe within days. Not weeks, days. Without electricity, hospitals cannot operate critical care equipment, ventilators, surgical suites, or the refrigeration systems that keep blood supplies and medications viable. Without electricity, food supply chains collapse because refrigeration stops working across the entire distribution network from warehouse to retail. Without electricity, the winter heating systems that millions of Iranians depend on, in a country that regularly experiences temperatures well below freezing across its northern and central regions, stop functioning entirely. The International Committee of the Red Cross has published detailed analysis of exactly what happens when electricity infrastructure is destroyed in a densely populated country. They call it the reverberating effects of attacks on electrical infrastructure, and their findings, drawn from what happened in Iraq after 1991, in Yugoslavia after 1999, and in Lebanon in 2006, are consistent and deeply alarming. In each case, the infrastructure damage outlasted the military campaign by years. In each case, the civilian population bore the overwhelming weight of the consequences, in preventable deaths, in disease outbreaks, in the collapse of healthcare systems that could not function without reliable power. The immediate military effect of destroying a power plant is limited. Armies find other ways to communicate. Command structures adapt. But the civilian population that depended on that grid for water, for warmth, for the functioning of every hospital and clinic in the country, they have nowhere else to turn. The humanitarian effect is catastrophic and long-lasting, extending months and years beyond the initial strike. Trump is threatening to obliterate two of the largest power plants on the grid of a country of 87 million people that is already under a sustained military campaign that has killed over 2,000 people and displaced millions more. Iran's response is equally specific and equally deliberate, and it deserves exactly the same level of careful analysis because it is not a vague counter-threat. It is a blueprint. The Iranian army statement named two precise categories of target: energy infrastructure and desalination facilities belonging to the United States and its allies across the Gulf region. Desalination facilities are not incidental infrastructure in the Gulf states. They are not backup systems or secondary water sources. They are existential infrastructure, the single mechanism by which populations in one of the most water-scarce regions on Earth sustain themselves. The United Arab Emirates gets approximately 42% of its total fresh water supply from desalination. Saudi Arabia gets approximately 70%. Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are all heavily dependent on desalination for their most basic water needs. The Persian Gulf's natural freshwater resources are essentially non-existent. Without desalination plants running continuously, these countries cannot sustain their populations. Full stop. Iran is not making a metaphorical threat. It is describing a precise military operation against civilian water infrastructure that directly mirrors the humanitarian logic of Trump's power plant ultimatum. You destroy what keeps our people alive. We destroy what keeps yours alive. The energy infrastructure dimension of Iran's counter-threat carries equally staggering implications for the global economy. Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq processing facility handles approximately 7% of global daily oil supply and was already on Iran's target list before this war began. The East-West pipeline, the Ras Tanura export terminal, the single largest crude oil loading facility in the world, the UAE's oil terminals at Fujairah, already struck twice in the course of this war, and Qatar's remaining LNG infrastructure at Ras Laffan, whatever was not already destroyed in earlier exchanges. Iran is describing, in the most formal military language available to it, a scenario in which it systematically dismantles the energy export infrastructure of every Gulf state that hosts American forces. Not selectively, comprehensively. The energy market is already trading at $112 a barrel. Goldman Sachs' worst-case scenario of 147.50 stops being a tail risk and becomes the base case. The cascading effects on global inflation, on supply chains already under pressure, on developing economies with no buffer against an energy price shock of that magnitude, these are not hypothetical academic projections. They are the direct, foreseeable, documented consequences of the sequence of events that both sides are now publicly threatening to set in motion. Now look at the context in which this ultimatum was delivered, because the timing tells you something crucial about what is actually happening inside the Trump administration right now. And it is not a reassuring picture. On Friday evening, less than 24 hours before the 48-hour ultimatum was posted, Trump published a statement on Truth Social saying that the United States is getting very close to meeting its objectives and is considering winding down its military efforts in the Middle East. Winding down. Those were his exact words on Friday night. Then, 24 hours later, on Saturday night from Mar-a-Lago, obliterate the biggest power plant first, 48 hours or else. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Washington noted the specific contradiction directly and publicly. There appears to be, he said, a gap between what the White House seems to want regarding the Strait of Hormuz and what the U.S. military says it has already accomplished. He called it notable, at the very least, to hear Trump talking about a major escalation given what officials had been saying throughout the day about how significantly the United States had degraded Iran's ability to target oil tankers in the Strait. That gap between the military's stated assessment that Iran's capacity to threaten Hormuz shipping has been significantly reduced and the president's ultimatum demanding Iran open the strait or face obliteration is not a communications problem or a messaging inconsistency. It is a strategic coherence problem, and it matters enormously for how this plays out. If the military's assessment is correct and Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the strait has already been substantially degraded, then the leverage behind a 48-hour compliance ultimatum is built on a foundation that may no longer exist. Iran may have already lost much of the military infrastructure that was keeping Hormuz effectively closed to normal traffic. If that is true, the strait may be opening not because Iran decided to comply with Trump's deadline, but simply because Iran no longer possesses the operational capability it once had. Compliance and incapacity are two very different things, and the difference matters enormously for what comes next. Because if the strait opens as a result of degraded Iranian capability rather than Iranian political concession, Trump cannot credibly claim his ultimatum produced results. And if he cannot claim it worked, the entire political logic for the escalation to power plants disappears, leaving only the damage done to American credibility by having issued an ultimatum in the first place. The timing of this ultimatum, posted one day after talking about winding down on a Saturday night from Mar-a-Lago, carries the distinct feel of a decision made without full coordination with the military command that is actually executing this war and living with its operational realities on the ground and at sea. The strategic calculations that serious analysts are now working through are grim on both sides of the fork in the road. If Trump follows through at 7:44 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, assuming Iran has not complied in a way that satisfies his stated conditions, at least three things happen simultaneously and immediately. Iran executes its stated counter-threat, and Gulf energy and desalination infrastructure comes under sustained attack. Saudi Arabia's oil terminals, the UAE's water supply systems, Qatar's remaining LNG capacity. The energy market faces a second shock of potentially historic severity on top of an already severely stressed baseline. And the humanitarian catastrophe inside Iran, already severe after 22 days of bombing that has killed thousands and displaced millions, enters a legal and moral category that the international community has very specific and very clear language for. The 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Power plants that provide electricity for water treatment systems, hospitals, heating infrastructure, and food supply chains for 87 million people fall directly and unambiguously within that category under international humanitarian law. This is not a contested legal interpretation or a gray area that clever lawyers might argue either way. It is the plain text of the law applied to the plain text of the threat. Every major international human rights organization on Earth would immediately and loudly characterize what happened in precisely those terms, and they would be correct to do so. The diplomatic isolation the United States has already experienced in this conflict, Switzerland blocking weapons exports, NATO declining to participate, European governments publicly describing this as not their war, would deepen dramatically and likely irreversibly. America's ability to build coalitions, to lead international institutions, to position itself as the defender of a rules-based international order would suffer damage that no military victory in the Strait of Hormuz could offset or repair. And then there is China. China sources approximately 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China has been watching this war with careful attention from the sidelines, methodically calculating its interests, maintaining a studied neutrality while observing how American military power performs under real operational conditions. A strike on Iranian power plants that triggers Iranian strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, sending oil prices to levels not seen in modern history and directly threatening the energy security of the Chinese economy and over 1 billion Chinese citizens. That is the specific scenario most likely to change Beijing's calculation about the costs and benefits of remaining on the sidelines. The implications of that shift are difficult to overstate. But the scenario in which Trump does not follow through carries its own severe and lasting consequences. If Monday arrives, Iran has not complied in any meaningful and verifiable sense, and the power plants remain standing, then this ultimatum joins a growing list. Every red line drawn in this war, open Hormuz within 48 hours, stop attacking Gulf infrastructure, cease targeting American military installations, has been stated with apparent conviction, restated for emphasis, and then either quietly allowed to expire without consequence or retroactively redefined when Iran did not comply. An ultimatum that runs out without producing the stated consequence is not simply a failed threat. It is information. It communicates to Iran and to every government watching this conflict unfold exactly how much weight to assign to the next ultimatum. It tells the Gulf states whose security arrangements and whose population's survival depend on the credibility of American commitments that the umbrella they are sheltering under has edges that can be found and tested. It tells China, Russia, North Korea, and every other actor calculating how far they can push in their own theaters that America's stated red lines may not be the actual red lines, that the distance between the declared threshold and the real one can be probed, measured, and exploited. Trump has made a series of statements in this war that have not proven accurate. He said the conflict would last 2 weeks. He said Iran was totally defeated. He said energy prices would drop like a rock. He said the United States was winding down its military efforts, and then 24 hours later he posted a 48-hour ultimatum threatening to obliterate civilian power infrastructure. Each of those statements at the moment it was made carried the full authority of the presidency and the implicit weight of American military power behind it. Each of them in the days that followed dissolved. What matters now is whether this one dissolves too, or whether Monday evening marks the moment when the words finally meet the action and the world discovers what that actually costs. The clock is running. Iran has not complied. In the hours since the ultimatum was posted, Iranian missiles struck Dimona and Arad on Saturday night, the first time in this conflict that Iranian missiles penetrated Israel's layered air defense systems in the Negev, injuring 64 people and shattering apartment buildings in the immediate vicinity of Israel's primary nuclear research facility. Iran also targeted Diego Garcia, the joint UK-US military base in the Indian Ocean, with what military analysts described as a 2-stage intercontinental ballistic missile, the first weapon of ICBM range to be used in this entire conflict. The war is not winding down. It is entering its most dangerous phase, and the world is now watching a single deadline count toward a decision that carries consequences severe enough that no one with full knowledge of what those consequences are could take them lightly. The deadline is Monday at 7:44 p.m. Eastern Time. And what happens at that moment will tell us more about the real limits of American power and intention in this conflict than anything that has come before it.